Hello, my name is Stephen Lyn Bales and welcome. A little bit of introduction about myself. I'm originally from Gatlinburg, grew up in Gatlinburg, actually grew up on Baskins Creek Road, one of the neighborhoods that was ravaged by the fire in 2016, and none of the buildings that I knew are there anymore. But to move on to a more pleasant topic, I've spent the last 20 years in Knoxville working at Imes Nature Center as an interpretive naturalist, working with kids and adults, getting them in touch with nature and aware of birds and frogs and all kinds of things that you can find even at an urban nature center like Imes. Of course, Imes is 300 acres, so it's not small. I've also written 3 books for the University of Tennessee Press about nature and natural history. The first one was called Natural Histories. Second one's about the ivory-billed woodpecker, a bird that was recently finally declared extinct. But my book takes place in the 1930s, and we follow the adventures of a man named James T. Tanner, who taught at UT as a zoology professor and ecology professor later on. But his PhD was at Cornell, and he was out to pursue and find, and he did find and did photograph the ivory-billed woodpecker. And they really lived in the swamps to the south. And then the third book is Ephemeral by Nature. I really look for natural history, nature topics that come and go, that are very ephemeral. You see them one minute, and the next minute they're gone, like monarch butterflies. That's one of the good examples. There's several chapters, each one's about a different ephemeral topic. But today we've got something, we're going to talk about something very different. We're going to be talking about wintering waterfowl. This is something that you may not even think about a lot. Birders love to get out into the woods and find birds, but mostly in the wintertime it may be hard to find them, but there's always somewhere waterfowl on the local lakes. In the Smokies, I've often found interesting birds on that large pond right at the beginning of Cades Cove. So, but primarily these birds are found on the large still lakes that are through the Tennessee Valley. Before we get there, since we're talking waterfowl, we have 2 species of duck. Mallard is something we all have known since we were like 4 years old. We knew what a mallard was. They're here year-round. We have 2 species of duck. These 2 species of duck are here year-round, which means they also nest here and lay their eggs here. And then the other one is harder to find because it's very secretive. That's a wood duck, and it's aptly named because you typically find them hidden in creeks up the woods somewhere, and the females will fly up to a hollow tree to lay her eggs, so she really is more woodpecker-like in a way, although she doesn't make her own nest. She looks for a hollow tree, or you can put up a wood duck box, which is similar to, say, a bluebird box, except much bigger, on a tree that overlooks the water. If you live near a cove or a lake, like Douglas Lake, any of those, you can maybe attract wood ducks to your property. And then finally, the one everyone knows, Canada goose, goose. Everyone knows Canada geese. They're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. So that's the duck goose. That's the goose that's here. They've almost become a nuisance species. They eat grass, so you often find them along greenways, and they eat grass, and grass does not have a lot of nutrition, so it passes through them very quickly. They don't have that complicated digestion system of a cow, so they hold on to the grass for a very short time, and then they let it go, whatever they can get out of it. But they weren't here for a long time. We had shot and killed them all and ate them. So Tennessee, they really weren't found in Tennessee to speak of from the late 1800s. Now, there were some that would migrate over Tennessee and maybe spend part of the winters here, but we did not have a resident population of Canada geese that did not migrate. We had, but then we didn't, because they made a great meal. But starting in the 1950s, there was a private landowner, farmer, rancher that started to captive breed Canada geese on his property in Sumner County. And he was so successful in raising geese and just letting them go, raising geese and letting them go, that TWRA and TVA joined with him because they could bring they could bring it across the state in 1966. So from that point on, there's been geese that have been raised and released. You don't have to do that anymore. There's enough geese out there on their own to have a sustainable population. So the next time you do see a goose, say you were walking a greenway and it walks in front of you and you think, oh, what are you doing here? Please remember, they were gone for decades, absolutely gone. So that's the story of Canada geese. Honor them and love them, and because they're here to stay now. And then this is the other odd duck that I often would get phone calls when I worked at IMS. The phone conversation would usually start, I've got this ugly duck. And as soon as they'd say the word ugly, I kind of knew what they were talking about. I'd say, well, describe. And they said, we got this ugly red face. Those are Muscovies. That's a domesticated duck, but they've escaped, and you can find them any and everywhere around, year-round. But that's a domesticated duck that originally came from the Muscovy duck from South America. This is what a wild Muscovy looks like in South America. So you can see through the domestication of it, it's become whiter and the face has become redder. But that's the other thing people often ask me about. What in the world is wrong with that duck's face? Absolutely nothing. That is just fleshy skin. It's hard for certain birds, it's hard to groom their faces and heads. And certain birds have evolved that they don't have feathers on their faces and heads. I can think of Sandhill Cranes, I can think of turkey vultures, black vultures, simply because of what they eat. In the case of vultures, they probably have a little bit of leftover roadkill on their face, and it's hard to clean off when it's been bedded in feathers. But for Muscovies, they're similar to Sandhill Cranes. They probe mud looking for worms and whatever to eat. Most ducks are omnivores, eat anything they can grab that's of nourishment. And because of that, they've evolved this fleshy skin. It's called a caruncle. And it also probably the males that have the greatest caruncle may get a little more attention from the females, but that's just fleshy skin that is much easier to wash off than trying to get mud that's embedded down in maybe the facial or the head feathers. Okay, now we're going to look at the waterfowl that are here. Again, this is wintering waterfowl. The earlier we talked about the two ducks and a goose that's here year-round. But the wintering waterfowl, they migrate here and just spend the winter time. So if you're a birder, a beginning birder, and you're working on your life list, and you may be sitting around this time of year and go, goodness, I'd like to add a bird or two to my life list. That's what birders do, they keep a life list. There's plenty of maybe different waterfowl that's out there that you've not really went to look for. And all you have to do is find still water as a rule and get your binoculars or your spotting scope. Some of them are out there drifting a little further from the shoreline. So we're going to look at some winter waterfowl. And how I got these numbers, I was curious because when I started doing this program, I thought, well, you know, if they like still water, they probably weren't here before TVA because Tennessee River was a raging river, and so TVA came and built dams to create the lakes and slow the raging river down so we weren't constantly being flooded, and to create cheap electricity for the people of East Tennessee. So I started reviewing in the Migrant magazine. It's a quarterly journal produced by the state TOS, Tennessee Ornithological Society. It's been coming out since the 1930s, I think. And I started looking through the numbers of what turns up at Christmas bird counts. And as I say, Norristown was built in 1936, and I tried to find the closest one I could to Christmas bird count to 1936. It turned out I had one at home that was for 1938. And you can see where I've circled 0 waterfowl was. So it took a while for all the dams to be completed and for the still water to back up. And that really turned the habitat of the Tennessee valley into Stillwater Lakes, which any fisherman will tell you, it's great for us too, but slowly over the course of time, waterfowl started spending the winters here. So then I created, this is the old days when we do spreadsheets by hand using a pencil and a ruler. So this was my spreadsheet. I reviewed all of these back several years of CBC data to try to figure out which were the most common waterfowl, and then some that maybe weren't quite as common but were still very interesting to look at. So that's how I came up with the ones we're going to talk about, the species that are in this program. This is what you don't. This is an American coot. It's not a duck. It's not web-footed. Look at those feet. Look at those toes. It does have fleshy phalanges, or like oars or paddles on its toes, which helps it move through water. Incredibly common, but you never just see one coot. They tend to hang out in large flocks of coots, and I looked it up. A large flock of coots is called a commotion of coots. So this one, usually if you see one, you see 10, 15, 50. They're all together floating in a commotion. Drop that word on your friends when you're out. Oh, that's a commotion of coots. So that's an American coot. It's also one of the few non-fish items that bald eagles will eat because they're pretty easy to catch for a bald eagle. So that's an American coot. Very common, very common. Also common is a pike-billed grebe. I love grebes. They're not ducks, but they are waterfowl. And the name comes from pike-bill, simply means spotted bill. They have a spot. But these guys are loners. They never, you usually see one here, maybe one there, not together. They may be with a commotion of coots. You can look out there and see 20 coots and one strange one floating among them. That's probably the pike-billed grebe. So it is the grebe that spends its winter here, pike-bill. And the hunters used to call them, and probably still do, devil divers, because these guys, when they dive, they can swim an incredibly long way, and you simply do not know where they're going to come up. They hunt for food underwater, and you can see the way this one is kind of built. Their legs are built at the back of the chassis, at the back of the torso, so they're absolutely wonderful swimmers and divers. And if you watch one and see one and it disappears underwater, it is very difficult to predict where it's going to pop up. It can pop up yards and yards and yards away in any direction, just pop up for a breath or two and disappear again. And it's because of the way they're built. They're built for diving. They do not do well on dry land at all. They do not walk well. In fact, I don't know if they can walk. You can see the bulk of the mass of the bird is in the front, so they tip over. Often I read about a flock of, and they're called water dance of grebes, that might be migrating out west, and they land on a wet parking lot. And from the air, a wet parking lot kind of looks like Stillwater Pond. And they'll land on a solid surface and not be able to get up. It usually takes some people to come up and just pick them up and throw them in the air. They're so built for diving that this is one bird that I can think of that really molts and drops all of its feathers on its wings at the same time. It's built for diving, so it's not necessarily flying, even though it flies much better than it walks. But it's one bird I know of. It becomes a little bit it can't fly for several weeks while it's growing its new flight feathers, but it's fine in the water. It'll just swim away from me and disappear. So that's two non-ducks. Now let's get into the ducks, because there's several we're going to look at today. First off, as I tell my students at IMS all those years, if you're watching a group of waterfowl ducks, and you've already said, okay, those are grebes, there's one, that's a grebe, those are coots, but you say, hey, those rest of them look different. I think those may be ducks. How you first separate them as far as which group they're in is just watch their behavior. There's two groups, there's dabbling ducks and there's diving ducks. The dabbling ducks are just like mallards. Ever since we were 4, we've watched mallards do this. They dabble. They tip over with their hind portion pointing straight up in the air. They feed in the upper level of the water. They're omnivores, whatever kind of floats in front of them. If it's a piece of water or grass or anything like that, they'll grab it, any plant, any animal. So they feed in the very top foot of water. But that's what you'll see from a distance. They don't dive under the water like the other group, but you'll see the hind portions pointing straight up in the air. These are the dabblers, and one of the smallest dabbler is green-winged teal. They're not here in big numbers. They're it's much smaller than a mallard, and typically if you see them out on the water, you don't really see the green wings because that's the secondary feathers. That's where when they fold their wings, they kind of tuck away and hide their secondary feathers along the back edge of the wing. But what you can notice with your binoculars or spotting scope, if you're trying to identify this bird for the first time, is that green mask it has over its eye. So you could typically, if the sun's right, it's hard to tell if it's a little darker or shady or overcast because the dark green and the chestnut of the head kind of blend together. But if you get a glimpse of that green mask, and then look back at that white flank on the back, kind of pointed in an arrow away from it, that's the two field markings you look for. Also, what's going on this time of year, even though they've migrated and even though they're away from home, the pair bonds start to form between the male and female duck. And the female ducks can be very hard to identify because they're all kind of camouflaged to hide when they're nesting. But the male and female are often together side by side, and they look the same size, but the female is camouflaged. So sometimes you'll identify the female simply by her companion, the male. So the pair bonds start forming here December, January, February, and then they migrate and go back to their nesting grounds further north. So that's one little hint on how to identify some of the female ducks. It's usually who they're keeping company with, to be honest. And then this is another duck, American widgeon. They're less common than the teals. They're much bigger than the teal. They also have a green mask. Look at that. You go, uh-oh, Stephen Lyn, here's another duck with a green mask. Well, it doesn't have the chestnut face or head, but the older name for this duck, I really almost prefer it because it's more descriptive. It was once called the bald pate, simply because bald in the very same sense of a bald eagle has a white head. It's not bald, it has a white head. The bald pate has a white noggin right at the top. And so you look for the white noggin, top of the head, and then the green stripes. So bald pate is the older name for it, and I think I like the older name almost better than widgeon. So that's another duck to look for. Again, it's a dabbler, so you're going to see it dip down with its hind portion pointed up. Gadwall, Gadwall, Gadwall. If you go out counting ducks, you're going to find a lot of Gadwalls. They're very common and not particularly easy to identify because you'd think, oh, there's not many field markings on that bird. That's probably a female. No, that's a male. Both male and female look very, very lacking in field markings is what's going on. But if you're staring at this bird, and I've done this before with friends of mine, what in the world is that? Oh my goodness, it's just another Gadwall. The field marking you do look for is a very plain, the front and top are all kind of a grayish. You look for the black on the hind quarters. Yeah, oh my goodness, and the white tail and the white little secondary feather that's marking it. That, oh my goodness, that's just yet another Gadwall, incredibly common. This is a bird you're going to find, this is a duck you're going to find in a lot of places around the valley. Northern Pintail, this is the only duck on our list that's actually declining in numbers. And we know a lot about duck because they're monitored by Ducks Unlimited. They are game birds, and they do have limited hunting season and the bag limits change depending on the population size. So we do have a very accurate kind of a thumbnail of their population. So this is one that's kind of declining. It's the only one that is declining. I love the silhouette of the bird. You can almost identify by the silhouette. It's got that long pointy tail where the name comes from, Pintail. And then that same kind of marking is up the side of the face, that white pin marking up the side. So that's what you look for, almost a silhouette, but they're declining probably, and they're less common. And people ask me, where do I go to find a pintail if they want it for their bird list? And I say, I'm not 100% sure. Their numbers are dropping, and their numbers are really dropping because they tend to, further north for their nesting season, they tend to lay their eggs out in meadows or fields, not close to the water, not on the shoreline like most ducks. And some of those to the north, some of those fields are now being used to grow soybeans, and so some of their former habitat has been taken away from them by farmers that are growing more and more soybeans. But I have read an article recently that Ducks Unlimited and Wildlife Federation are raising money to acquire more property that will be pintail habitat. So there is a movement afoot to create more habitat for northern pintails. Here's the slide I started with. This is a male and a female, and again, often this time of year you'll see a mated pair together. He stays very protective of her. He won't let another pintail even close. He won't let her look at another male pintail, so he's very protective and watches. But you often can identify a female. Now she's got a long ponytail too, but often because of who she's keeping company with. But this is one bird we're kind of watching. I think it's in the top 10 of birds in decline that we're working to kind of bolster up their population, similar to the Canada goose we talked about earlier. Now we get to the diving ducks. Those are the most common dabblers. There's a few I didn't include, but those are the most common. And then the diving ducks. The diving ducks are different. They disappear like a grebe underwater. And you'll see them disappear. They're not quite like a grebe in that they can stay gone for a devilishly long time. But these are all diving ducks that feed deeper into the water and where the dabblers can't reach. So we'll look at some of the diving ducks. Redhead. Perfect name. Some birds you wonder, why do they call them that? Why do they call it a widgeon? Anyway, a redhead. A perfectly descriptive name for this duck. It's a redhead. We had one that spent several weeks on the Quarry Lake in Hines one winter. It was there for several weeks and then it moved on. But it's got a redhead. It's solid, not woodpecker red, more of a cinnamony color. Or rusty color, but that's a redhead. And it is this year, it is the star on the duck stamp. This is the 2022 duck stamp. The artist was James Huntman, and every year there's a brand new duck stamp. It's sold by Ducks Unlimited and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And all the money raised from the sale of duck stamps goes to these conservation efforts, like I just mentioned with northern pintail. So there's people that have a huge collection of duck stamps, and this goes back to 1934 under the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They wanted to come up with a way to raise money, kind of independent money, of not only from hunters but naturalists and birders like myself, to raise money to help conservation causes. So since 1934, and again, this is the brand new duck stamp for 2022. I think it goes on sale in June, so it's a gorgeous redhead. And speaking of redhead, there's a caveat here. There's another duck that's got mostly a cinnamon head, not as bright as the redhead. This is a canvasback. It gets its name because the back supposedly looks like canvas. Okay, but it's got a much longer, darker bill, and it's a much bigger duck than a redhead. But this is the duck, just to show that things change. This is a duck that was pretty much extinct from overhunting in the late 1800s, but it's been slowly brought back. by these conservation efforts from, again, from Ducks Unlimited, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And so now it's doing decently, it's doing okay. You can see them out in the waters, I see them occasionally, but it's the largest of the diving ducks. When it goes, but again, it doesn't stay down like a grebe that long. Reneck Duck. These are very common. I know as a reference point, there's a pond in the middle of downtown Maryville. You wouldn't expect ducks to be in the middle of a downtown, but there's a very large pond in a greenway that goes all the way around in downtown Maryville. It's always filled with ringneck ducks. Now the problem is, and it's a problem that'll never be fixed, that's an awful name for it. It does not have a ring around its neck. That little spike of white that's kind of more on the shouldery area doesn't go all the way around. So it's not a ringneck duck. It is a ring-billed duck. It has 2 rings around its bill, and that would have been a better name for it, but it's out there. Very, very common, but not a great name. I would have named it double ring bill or something like that, not ring neck. But that's a very common duck. You tend to identify it by the 2 white stripes around its bill. And as again, there's a lot of them out there. Another common one, and I just love this one. This is a small, petite diving duck, Bufflehead. Look at that head. It got its name because for somebody, one of our ancestors said, it's a small duck, but look at the head. Somebody said, it's got a head as big as a buffalo's head. It's got it's a bit of a hyperbole, but it's got a very, very large head. And it's got that white marking. This is how it signals when it kind of lifts those feathers up on its head. This is how it's flashing to attract attention from the females and kind of flashing to drive other males away from its little pondy area. There's all kinds of competition that goes on out there, just like the birds in your backyard. So that's a Bufflehead duck, incredibly large head for a duck. And the white marking, the white marking comes and goes depending on how erect its head feathers are. Goldeneye, I love this. Sounds like a James Bond movie, Common Goldeneye. It's got a green head similar to a mallard. It's a very large diving duck, not as common, but and from a distance, it's kind of hard to see the golden eye, but it's not hard to see that white cheek patch just behind the dark bill and the green head. The cheek patch is really what you first notice on the head of the duck if you're looking for field markings. So a very large diving duck, just not as common as some of the others we've talked about. Lesser Scaup, we also have a greater Scaup, and they look very similar. The greater Scaup has a little lighter back and it's bigger, but when I was checking my data, the lesser Scaups turn up here more often than the greater Scaup, so I only included the lesser Scaup. This one I prefer the original name. The original name is Little Bluebill because it's got a little blue bill. I love it when the bird's name really is descriptive. So this one is Little Bluebill, lesser Scaup. I'm pretty sure, yes, we recently did the Audubon Christmas bird count in Knox County, and I'm sure in Knoxville, Knox County, and I'm sure lesser Scaups turned up probably more, or certainly more of them than greater Scaups. Now we got a diving duck that's adorable. I don't see it that often. I don't know if I should even use the word adorable when I'm describing a duck, but this duck is adorable. It's a stiff-tailed duck, and that's very descriptive of what it looks like. It's the little Ruddy Duck, not that common here, but out there, they're found. But it swims around with its tail stuck up in the air, kind of like a wren. With that tail erect, I am a Ruddy Duck. This is a very petite duck. It's really quite small, with that white cheek marking that covers the whole face and then the blue bill. But what you will notice from a distance is small duck, much smaller than a mallard, maybe half the size of a mallard, maybe a little bigger. But that erect tail, that stands out even on poor lighting conditions, even when it's, say, overcast. You'll notice the silhouette of the duck, that erect tail. That's a little tiny Ruddy Duck. Now we're going to get into a couple of mergansers. These are the predator ducks. These are predators. Hooded merganser, very common. Notice it doesn't have what you would call a typical duck bill, flat. It's got a pointed bill that's serrated, so it's almost a duck with teeth. And they're a diving duck. They swim deep underwater to catch fish, small fish, and so they have a serrated bill. It's got that white marking very similar to the bufflehead, but and both buffleheads and hooded merganser are fairly common, but the hooded merganser has a cinnamon flank and black on the front, but it's really, and then the white marking. The body of the merganser is much more colorful than the body of the bufflehead, but if you can get a good look at the bill, it's long and pointed with serrations. It's almost, again, it's almost a duck with teeth because it dives and swims and chases fish. So that's the hooded merganser. I see these quite often in different places. And then a common merganser, this is really not here that much, but occasionally they are. I saw, the first time I saw them in our general area was at Seven Islands State Birding Park. I was out there with two friends. We were just looking for birds. That's what you do at the State Birding Park. And saw these two mated pair, we assumed, at least they were hanging out together, and coming down the river. And at first, even from a distance, we couldn't tell what they were. When they finally got to our location and we could see them, oh my gosh, that's common mergansers. Absolutely gorgeous. The female has the red head that's all splayed out like that, so that's common mergansers. Part of me thinks this is a newish duck to our wintering waterfowl. Their numbers will grow, but I just don't have the data to back that up, so I'm kind of guessing that. But they're very large and very beautiful. Cranes. We got a couple of cranes, and we'll be finished with the principal waterfowl. Cranes are considered waterfowl. They're not ducks. They're much taller and lanky and long-legged. So two cranes. This is Sandhill cranes. Very similar to Canada geese. We shot them all. We ate them all. They were gone virtually by the late 1800s. There were really no, you couldn't find Sandhill cranes in East Tennessee to speak of. Because we shot them and ate them. But now the population, through protection again, I have nothing against hunters because they're very good at protecting and finding ways to protect populations of these birds that are considered game birds. Anyway, now the population is believed to be up around 90,000, 89 or 90,000, and roughly 20,000 pass over East Tennessee or maybe even spend the winters here. This is the famous crane. You go to Hiawassee Wildlife Refuge down in Meigs County, north of Chattanooga, and you may see dozens of sandhill cranes. They feed in the muddy shorelines typically. They're right in the grass in the muddy shorelines and in the shallow waters near that along the coves. And the public viewing area in Hiawassee is a gazebo built. It looks out on one of the coves, and you'll find buffleheads, you'll find mergansers, and you'll find cranes. It's really a good collection point for some of these waterfowl I mentioned. But now they're back in good numbers, and where they had been expatriated. And this is a Sandhill Crane adult with a young one called a Coot, and long and lanky, and notice the carbuncle on the front of its face. Again, just like the muscovies, they tend to probe mud down on the shorelines for worms and insects and whatever else, and so it helps them keep their faces from getting all where the mud's caked down in feathers if they were there. The famous one, this is kind of the poster child for endangered species, the whooping crane. They were in serious trouble, serious trouble. By the late 1900s, there were none in the east. The cranes historically, whooping cranes historically, there was a western population that migrated down across the Great Plains. There was a non-migratory flock in Louisiana, that didn't go anywhere. They stayed there, and then there was an eastern migratory flock that flew from southern Canada and the Great Lakes area through Tennessee all the way to the Gulf. But the last one of the eastern flock, I found an article that it was shot and killed in St. Augustine, Florida in the early 1900s. So this is a bird that was seriously endangered. By the late 1940s, there were only roughly 20 in the world. And those 20 were either living in zoos or were part of that western flock that migrated from Canada all the way to Aransas. And some of this money I'm talking about that was used to protect these things went to buy the first National Wildlife Refuge at Aransas, Texas, just to protect the wintering home of whooping cranes. And they're doing better now. Their population is growing, but the last data I saw has their total population in the world of roughly 800, maybe more, and that's still seriously endangered. An ill-timed hurricane and our weather's starting to be funkadelic, or any kind of disease could wipe this all of whooping cranes out just like that. So it's still very endangered, but we've gone since 1940 from a population of around 20, like I said, to a population of about 800. So that's taken a lot of work, a lot of conservation dollars, and a lot of people rolling up their sleeves and figuring out what they can do to help. This is a photograph I took at the International Crane Foundation in 2006. I can't believe it was 2006, it was like it was yesterday. But that's a mated pair that are parents that can't fly. And so they're non-releasable, they're impaired, and they still can raise a healthy young crane that can be moved to a wild population. So that's one of the things that happens at ICF. But then along came a story, you may remember a movie, Father Goose, about Bill Lishman, who raised a group of Canada geese in Canada. He's Canadian, with his daughter, and he came up with a radical idea of teaching that, they had raised them on the farm, teaching that flock of geese, that small group, to migrate. And so he taught them to follow an ultralight aircraft called a trike, because it's got 3 wheels. And he took those Canada geese, it's all in the movie, Father Goose, about Bill Lishman. I think Jeff Daniels plays Bill Lishman in the movie. And it worked. He took geese to the coastline. He left, he and his daughter come back, and the geese flew back the next. That's part of it. You can teach them one direction. It's interesting in that a bird as big as a whooping crane, and it's the tallest bird in America, can be taught to, has to be taught to migrate, where to go. They have the urge to fly. They don't know where to go. Where a little tiny hummingbird that comes to your backyard and feeds every year, they know where to go. The young ones aren't taught by their parents. They just take off and know where to go. They go to Costa Rica, anyway, and other Central American countries. So Bill Lishman approached the Crane Federation and said, I can teach whooping cranes how to migrate. And they had a desire to rebuild an eastern flock of migratory whooping cranes that would come through East Tennessee and go all the way to Florida. And they said, okay, let's try it. So they did. And that's a photograph I think I took, I lose track, of one of the ultralights and a whooping crane following it. That's perhaps Bill Lishman flying, or his partner's name was Joe Duff. And they had other pilots. And for a period of 10, 12 years, each year they raised a new flock of whooping cranes, young whooping cranes, and taught them how to migrate, taught them how to go to Florida. And then the people disappeared and the birds flew back on their own. They just need to be taught one way. They return on their own. And my last, I think this is our last little slide. This one, one of my favorite memories, when the whooping cranes, the young whooping cranes would spend a night or two in East Tennessee, they were taught to come to Hiawassee Wildlife Refuge. It's in Meigs County. And what you see behind us is the corral, these young cranes that have been, a lot of money had been spent to train those. That's where they spent the night. And once they were inside there, it would be covered with canvas. So they were totally protected from any predator. And the corral itself, it's a round corral that is built on land and part in the water, in the mud, and on land. And then one year they had a problem with one of the whooping cranes when they're probing mud to eat, just like the Sandhill Crane, sometimes they pull up a piece of trash, a piece of debris. It's incredible. And if they swallowed it, it could do real harm. So a friend of mine named Vicki Henderson, she volunteered to clean up the mud inside the pen. She recruited me for mines, and the first year we did this, it was just Vicki and I, and it took all day. She called and said, "How do you clean mud?" I said, "Well, I don't know. Let's take a couple of rakes." And we really did rake up a real pile of pop tops and pieces of glass, spent shotgun shells, just debris of our culture. And so we spent hours raking through all the mud, trying to make it perfectly clean for these gorgeous birds to spend there. And then in 2004, we found some help. Some of you may recognize those faces. They're all East Tennessee volunteers, I think. And including that's a friend of mine, Paul James, who was executive director of Limes for years. He's a second from the left. But we spent hours with rakes, and one year we even had a metal detector. And you would not believe what we were digging up from the mud. But the cranes were fine. That program has moved on. They've established a flock. But that's a good look back at my life in 2004. And I think that's it. You've got a general good view of wintering waterfowl in our area, and it's been a growing kind of phenomena because the Tennessee Valley is now a series of stillwater lakes. It's a perfect place for waterfowl to spend their winters before they return back north. And this will give you something if you're cooped up and want to go find an interesting bird. You can go to the woodlands, yes. You can go to the meadows, yes. But you can also go to a shoreline at Douglas Lake or any of the lakes and just kind of take your binoculars and see what you see floating around. But we'll see you at the Wilderness Wildlife Week at the end of the month, and have a good day.